September 17th, 1944, 9:55 in the morning on the chalk ridge east of Boulogne-sur-Mer on the Channel coast of France. A Canadian section commander swings himself up over the side of a kangaroo, a ram tank with the turret cut away, 10 men packed into the hole where the fighting compartment used to be, and shouts at the man behind him to keep his head below the rim. 90 minutes earlier, 792 aircraft came in over that coast in waves. Lancasters, Halifaxes, Mosquitoes. In under an hour, they put 3,232 tons of bombs onto the high ground in front of him. One attack, one morning. The hill is called Mont Lambert, 550 feet of concrete, wire, and buried steel, and when the last aircraft turns for England, the crest is smoking so thickly that the Canadian gunners can no longer see what they are shooting at. So when those carriers start rolling, the reasonable expectation is that nothing up there is still alive. Then the German guns open. Not a stray round, not one stubborn crew. 8 separate batteries fired on the Canadians that morning that Allied intelligence did not know existed. Batteries that were not on any map handed out before the attack, while the maps that were handed out carefully marked positions that turned out to be plywood and paint. And I want to give you one number before we go any further, because everything in this story sits on top of it. During the fight for Boulogne, Canadian gunners put 5,700 rounds into a circle 300 yards across, trying to kill a single German battery. 5,700. That battery kept working. It fired roughly 2,000 rounds back. Hold that number. It comes back. If what the Canadians did on this coast matters to you, a subscribe helps these stories reach the people who still remember it. Now step back from that ridge, because the strange part is not the fighting. The strange part is where the war was that week. By the middle of September 1944, the German army in the west had effectively come apart. The Normandy front had broken open in August. Paris was free, Brussels was liberated on the 3rd of September, Antwerp on the 4th. Antwerp, one of the great ports of Europe, taken with its docks nearly intact by British armor that covered the last 250 miles faster than the Germans could burn their own paperwork. Allied spearheads were up against the Dutch border. The talk at Supreme Headquarters was no longer about whether Germany would be beaten, but about which week it would happen. The front line was 300 miles east of Mont Lambert. 300 miles. That is farther than Toronto to Ottawa and most of the way back. Everything between that ridge and the fighting was liberated country. French towns with flags out, Allied traffic on the roads, field hospitals, fuel dumps, war correspondents typing. And on this strip of coast, behind all of it, deep inside territory that every map showed as one, German guns were still firing. Not firing to cover a retreat. There was no retreat. There was nowhere to retreat to. Here is how far it went. Across the water from that ridge, 21 miles away, the town of Dover in England was still being shelled. Still. Heavy German coastal guns had been dropping shells on Kent since the 12th of August, 1940, 4 years and a month by then. And in the 3rd week of September 1944, with Germany losing everywhere on earth, those guns had not stopped for a single week. Children in Dover had grown from infants to school children under that shelling. It was simply the weather where they lived. So put the two facts side by side, because this is the question the whole story turns on. The German army in France had collapsed, and on the Channel coast, something was still firing. At Canadian infantry on the ridges, and over their heads at civilians in England, as though the collapse had never happened, as though the war it belonged to were still being won. What was it? Not who in the loose sense. What, exactly, kept those guns in action after everything behind them had folded? And why did the job of walking up to it and switching it off land on the 1st Canadian Army? That second part has an answer, and it is on paper. On the 6th of September, Field Marshal Montgomery sent a signal about the Channel ports that contained one blunt sentence: "I want Boulogne badly." 3 days later, General Harry Crerar, commanding 1st Canadian Army, put out a directive to his corps commanders that did not hedge at all. A speedy and victorious conclusion to the war, he wrote, now depended fundamentally on the capture by 1st Canadian Army of the Channel ports. Fundamentally. That is a heavy word for a general to sign his name under while the rest of the Allied armies are racing for Germany. The Canadians were not sent to mop up a sideshow. They were sent because somebody at the top had worked out that the war could not be finished until this coast was silenced. And the men doing the walking up to it were about to find out why that was harder than anyone at the top understood. Because the first answer they got, the obvious one, the one that made sense to everybody, was wrong. Start with the answer everybody assumed then, because it is the answer most people still assume now. Fanatics. Hand-picked diehards. SS men in concrete boxes who had decided to die for Hitler and were going to make the Canadians pay for every yard of it. That is the picture, and it is the picture the men climbing those ridges half expected to find. The documents say something else entirely. The German commander at Boulogne was Lieutenant General Ferdinand Heim. He had been given the fortress only weeks before the Allied advance cut it off from the rest of the German army, and he was handed an order to build a landward defense. That is, to fortify the town against an attack coming from inland, from France, from behind, with no specialist troops and no engineering resources to do it with. The coastal side of Boulogne was magnificent, concrete poured for years. The landward side was scratchwork. His garrison was about 10,000 men. On paper, that sounds formidable. Look at what it was actually made of. 1 fortress machine gun battalion, 2 fortress infantry battalions of low category personnel. That phrase, low category, is the German army's own filing term for men it had graded as unfit for a real front, plus artillery and engineer detachments from a broken infantry division. Heim's own assessment of their quality, in his own words afterward, was that it was not especially high. 25 miles up the coast at Calais, the commandant was Lieutenant Colonel Ludwig Schröder. He had roughly 7,500 men, of whom only about 2,500 could be used as infantry at all. The rest were needed to work the coastal guns and the port. Asked later what he had been commanding, Schröder used a single word for his own garrison: rubbish. Mere rubbish. And when Canadian intelligence officers finished processing the prisoners from Calais, the summary they wrote is one of the least heroic paragraphs in the entire campaign. The army personnel, they concluded, were old, were ill, and lacked both the will to fight and the will to resist interrogation. The naval personnel were old and had never been trained for fighting on land. Only the Luftwaffe anti-aircraft gunners showed any sign of good morale. Old men, sick men, sailors who had never been infantry. That is what was still firing at Canadians 300 miles behind the front. So hold the fanatic theory up to the light, and it falls apart in your hands. Which leaves the real question standing there, larger than before. If these were not devoted men, if a good number of them wanted very much to be somewhere else, why did they keep shooting? Because of a piece of paper. On the 19th of January, 1944, Hitler designated 11 Atlantic and Channel ports as fortresses: Festungen, Le Havre, Boulogne, Dunkirk, Cherbourg, Saint-Malo, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and the rest. On the 4th of September, with the front collapsing westward behind him, he issued the order again and harder. The port areas were fortresses, and they were to be held to the last man. The commandant of each one was personally responsible for that, with his name, his rank, and his family. Understand what that does to a garrison. A field division that is losing can retreat. It has trucks, it has legs, it has a rear. A fortress garrison has none of those things. It is not a formation that is choosing to stay. It is a formation that has been legally and physically nailed to the ground, given a coastline it cannot leave, and told that leaving it is a capital matter. The men inside are not deciding anything at all. And now notice the design, because this is the part that turns your stomach a little once you see it. The German High Command did not put its best troops on that coast. It put its worst, the old, the sick, the graded unfit, the naval gunners, behind its best concrete, precisely because concrete does not require good soldiers. A frightened 48-year-old with a machine gun and 8 feet of reinforced concrete over his head is worth more, defensively, than a veteran in a trench. That was not an accident of the collapse. That was the whole idea. Which means the first real layer of the answer is this. What kept firing at the Canadians was not an army. It was an order, wrapped in concrete, with reluctant men inside it. And the Canadians proved it themselves, twice in the same battle. On the 18th of September, the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders went at their first objectives outside Boulogne. Germans in field positions, hasty works, the landward stuff Heim had never been given the means to build properly. 45 minutes. That is how long it took. Men came out with their hands up in the time it takes to eat lunch. The same week, on the same hill system, against garrison troops of exactly the same miserable quality, Montlambert was supposed to be taken on the first day. It held for 24 hours. Same soldiers, same morale, same war. The only variable that changed was what they were standing inside. So the Canadians now had half an answer, and half an answer is a dangerous thing to have when you are the one who has to go up the hill. They knew the men in front of them did not want to fight. They knew the concrete was the reason it didn't matter. What they did not yet know was how much of it there was, or what it would do to their weapons when they finally got close enough to touch it. That lesson was waiting on Montlambert, and when the North Nova Scotia Highlanders finally got inside, what they found there changed the way the Canadian Army fought for the rest of the coast. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders spent the 17th and the night that followed working their way into Montlambert, and they cleared it early on the 18th. What they walked into when they got inside is worth describing because it explains the whole rest of this coast. Montlambert was not a hill with guns on it. It was a hill with a building in it. Concrete galleries, steel doors, ammunition chambers, sleeping quarters, firing positions sited so that each one covered the approach to the next. All of it roofed with enough reinforced concrete that a direct hit from a heavy bomb registered inside as an unpleasant noise and a shower of dust. Now put a number on what that concrete cost. Between 1942 and 1944, the Germans poured roughly 17 million cubic meters of concrete into the Atlantic Wall and worked 1.25 million tons of steel into it. 1,200 miles of coast, from Denmark to the Spanish frontier, around 15,000 bunkers. In 1943 alone, 250,000 laborers were putting down 800,000 tons of concrete a month. 250,000 men. That is a city working full-time for years on nothing but walls. Hitler thought so too. He personally sketched bunker designs, and he said of himself, without embarrassment, that he was the greatest fortress builder of all time. And here is the thing about a wall that size. It was built on one assumption, that the fighting would happen at it, once, when the Allies came ashore. Nobody in Berlin ever seriously designed it for the situation the Canadians were now looking at, where the invasion had already come ashore 200 miles to the west, gone past, and left the wall standing behind it like a fence around an empty field. The wall could not be moved. It could not be told the war had changed. It simply went on being a wall. Which brings us back to the number I asked you to hold on to. 5,700 rounds. That is what Canadian gunners put into a circle 300 yards across at Boulogne to kill one German battery. And the report notes, in the flat voice these reports always use, that the battery nevertheless continued in action and fired some 2,000 rounds. Sit with that arithmetic for a second, because it is the moment the Canadians understood what they were up against. Nearly 3 of their shells for every 1 of the enemy's, and the enemy was still shooting. The tanks did no better. A Canadian officer watching Sherman rounds hit those installations described what they did in a sentence you cannot improve on. They used to bounce off, he said, like peas on a tin roof. Peas on a tin roof. 75mm armor-piercing shot from the standard tank of the Western Allies, and the concrete didn't notice. The Germans, meanwhile, had heavy coastal pieces up to 12 inches in the Boulogne defenses. An officer of the 1st Hussars, Canadian tankers, veterans of Juno Beach, men not easily impressed, wrote about the noise of those shells coming over and said plainly that it shook them to see what those guns could do. So this is the second layer of the answer, and it is bigger than the first. The reason the guns on this coast were still firing after the German front had collapsed is that nothing at long range could make them stop. Not 792 bombers, not 3,000 tons in an hour, not 328 artillery pieces, which is what Brigadier Todd had assembled for Boulogne. 5 field regiments, 7 medium, 3 heavy, 2 heavy anti-aircraft, plus British gunners on loan. All of that, and the concrete kept talking. There was exactly one way to switch a position like that off. Somebody had to walk up to it and get inside. And the heavy bombardment made even that harder, which is the cruel joke sitting in the middle of this whole campaign. On the 18th of September, the Canadians needed one route open to get their armor forward, and the ground had been so comprehensively rearranged by their own bombing that the flail tanks, the ones with the spinning chains built precisely to beat a lane through a minefield, could not work in it. So Canadian engineers cleared that route by hand. Understand what that sentence contains. A sapper, on his knees, in chalk churned into powder, with a probe and a pair of wire cutters, finding German mines one at a time, in the open, while the guns that could not be silenced from 20 miles away went on firing over his head. No armor, no speed, just a man's hands and the amount of daylight he had left. That route opened, the armor went forward, and the Canadians started building the toolkit that would take them the rest of the way along this coast. Kangaroos to carry infantry into small arms range without losing half of them on the way. Flails for the minefields, AVREs, Churchill tanks carrying a short mortar that threw a 40-pound demolition charge, a weapon the crews called the Flying Dustbin, designed for one purpose, which was hitting fortifications at spitting distance. And the Crocodile, a Churchill towing an armored trailer of fuel, throwing flame 100 yards. Not better shells, different physics. If you cannot break the box, you get inside the box. Heim's fortress had 4 days left. What the Canadians did not know, as they paid for those 4 days at a rate that would come to 634 men, was that the prize they were buying had already been destroyed. Not by the bombers, not by them. September 19th, 1944. The upper town of Boulogne. Above the modern city sits the old walled citadel, medieval ramparts, a gatehouse, a portcullis, walls thick enough that they had been useful in the 1400s and were still useful now. German troops were inside it. The Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders were outside it, and getting in through a gate designed to stop an army with siege ladders was going to cost men. Then a French civilian came to Major J.G. Stothart and told him about a tunnel, not a rumor, a specific passage into a specific part of the works, known to the people who had lived their whole lives in that town and to nobody in the German garrison's planning. A man who had been occupied for 4 years walked up to a Canadian officer and handed him the back door to his own city. Stothart used it. And while his men went in the quiet way, the Churchill tanks came up out front and did the loud thing, raking the ramparts with machine gun fire, then bringing the petards forward to put those 40-pound demolition charges against the portcullis itself. In Stoddart's own account, the gate was effectively blown in, and at once a host of white flags waved from the walls. About 200 prisoners came out of the citadel. 16 of them were officers. That is how the last 4 days of Boulogne went. Not one great collapse, but a series of boxes opened one at a time, each one needing its own solution. The Highland Light Infantry got across the River Liane on repaired bridging and went at the Outreau Peninsula and paid 64 casualties for it. The Camerons took Ekelang. The Glengarrians went for a battery position the Canadians had codenamed Buttercup, 6 88s and 4 20mm guns dug in behind wire, and brought 185 prisoners out of it. And then Herculing produced the moment that everyone in the division retold afterward. The Canadians had taken the position. The fighting there was over, the ground was theirs. Men were sitting on captured concrete eating out of tins. And underneath them, in the tunnel system, roughly 400 German soldiers had been hiding the entire time, waiting to see how it turned out. When they decided it had turned out badly, they came up out of the ground and surrendered in a body. The Canadians called it the bargain basement. 400 men, under the feet of the troops who thought they had already won that hill. On the 21st, a Canadian Army photographer caught a picture of Private F.J. Coakley of the North Shore Regiment, sitting on top of a captured German coastal gun, one boot up on the barrel, the way you would sit on a fence, Look at that photograph and you can see exactly what those men believed they had just accomplished. Fort de la Crèche went last, on the 22nd, after 78 medium bombers worked it over, about 500 more prisoners. And at 4:30 that afternoon, Lieutenant General Ferdinand Heim surrendered the fortress of Boulogne to Brigadier John Rockingham. 9,517 Germans went into the cages. 6 days. The Canadian bill was 634 killed, wounded, and missing. 2 Canadian brigades lost more men taking Boulogne than 2 British divisions lost taking Le Havre, which was a bigger place with a bigger garrison. The Highland Light Infantry alone counted 97 casualties, 18 of them dead. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders, 96, 27 dead. Now, the Canadians had the port, except they didn't. Because there is a set of air photographs taken over that coast on the 13th of September, and they are dated 4 days before the first bomb of the assault fell. Those photographs show dozens of neat craters running along the quays, evenly spaced, deliberately placed, the signature of engineers working carefully with charges and a plan, not of anything dropped from an aircraft. Cranes, lock gates, quay walls, rail connections. The Germans had methodically wrecked the harbor before the battle even started. Boulogne could not take a ship until the 12th of October, 3 weeks after it fell. Read that again alongside the casualty figure. 634 Canadians for a port that had already been killed before they started by men who then stayed and made the Canadians come and get them anyway, and the firing did not stop. That is the part that changes everything. Boulogne surrendered on the 22nd of September, and the guns on that coast kept working, because the heavy batteries around Calais and out on Cape Gris Nez had ranges of over 25 miles, and Boulogne harbor sat inside that circle. Minesweepers could not safely clear the approaches. Ships could not safely come in. The Canadians had captured the port and could not use it, and would not be able to use it while those guns existed. So look at what has happened to our question. We started by asking what kept firing after the German front collapsed, and the easy assumption was that these garrisons were defending something. Ports, supplies, a strategic asset. They were not. The asset was already destroyed, by their own side, in advance, on purpose. There was nothing behind those walls to defend. They were firing because firing was the mission. The order was never to hold a port. The order was to make the Allies spend. And General Courard's list had 4 names on it, in order of importance, and Boulogne was only the second one. The next name was Calais. At Calais, there was something Boulogne never had. Guns big enough to reach England. Guns that had been dropping shells on the town of Dover every few days for 4 years and 1 month. On the morning the Canadians came within sight of them, they were still doing it. September 25th, 1944. 10:15 in the morning on the ridges southwest of Calais. The weather had already ruined half the plan. Nearly 900 bombers were sent that morning. Cloud meant only 303 of them attacked, putting down 1,300 tons instead of the several thousand the infantry had been promised. The Canadians went anyway. The first thing they found set the tone for the whole battle. Le Régiment de la Chaudière went up the white cliff of Cap Blanc-Nez, expecting a fight for a fortified headland, and took the garrison, close to 200 men, with almost no trouble at all. When the Chaudières got in among them, the report notes, most of the defenders were found dead drunk. 200 men, on a cliff, drinking, at 10 in the morning, while a Canadian brigade came up the slope. Keep that image, because we are going to set it against something in a moment, and the contrast is the thing I want you to feel. The main effort of the 8th Brigade that morning went to the North Shore Regiment, and their objective was a piece of high ground about 5 miles southwest of Calais called Noirmotte, standing over the village of Sangatte. Underneath and around that ridge was the largest battery on this coast, the one the Germans had named Lindemann. 3 guns of 16-inch caliber, the caliber of a battleship's main armament, in casemates built to survive anything the Royal Air Force could carry. The North Shore attack went in the way these attacks now had to go in. Flail tanks beat lanes through the minefields, chains hammering the ground ahead of the infantry. Armor came up on the flanks and put covering fire onto the emplacements. The infantry worked forward into the position. And then, on Noirmotte, something happened that had not happened at Boulogne. The Germans started talking. Negotiations, that is the word in the record, continued through the night of the 25th. Picture what that actually means. Canadian infantrymen lying out in the dark on a chalk ridge, on ground they had partly taken and partly not, close enough to the enemy to hold a conversation, waiting while messages went back and forth about whether the men a few yards away were going to give up. All night. In the early hours of the 26th, the German commander there surrendered. 285 prisoners came out of Noirmotte and the Sangat battery. Now I need you to hold two places in your head at the same time, because what I am about to tell you happened on the same date, and it is the center of this entire story. The 26th of September, 1944. Across the water in Dover, England, 50 shells fell on that town that day. 5 people were killed. A soldier at Broadley's Road, a sailor in Snargate Street when a public house was hit, an airman in Frith Road, and a 63-year-old woman named Patience Ransley. Here is where she was when it happened. Barwick's Cave was one of Dover's deep shelters, a tunnel 900 feet long driven into the chalk of the cliff, lined with reinforced concrete 38 feet below the surface. In a town that had been shelled for 4 years, that tunnel was as safe as human beings could arrange for themselves. People slept there. It was the place you went precisely so that this could not happen to you. A 16-inch shell weighing a ton came out of Lindemann Battery at Sangat, went up over the channel, and came down on Dover at about 35 degrees off the vertical, doing 1,500 feet per second. It struck the Cowgate Cemetery on the cliff above the shelter. It went through a grave. Then it bored down through 24 more feet of solid chalk, and it burst 7 feet above the concrete roof of the tunnel, tearing that roof open over a span of 12 feet. She was underground, under a graveyard, under 24 feet of rock, under reinforced concrete, and it reached her anyway. Patience Ransley was the last civilian killed by the cross-channel guns. Now put the two halves of the 26th of September together, because they are the answer to the question this story is asking. While Canadian infantrymen were lying on a chalk ridge in the dark, talking a German garrison into surrendering, the battery beneath that ridge was firing at England, not at them. That is the detail that changes the shape of everything. The great cross-channel guns were not built to fight infantry, and mostly could not turn inland to do it. Their casemates and their arcs pointed out over the water. The Canadians climbing towards them were, as far as those guns were concerned, not the enemy. The enemy was Dover, 21 miles away, exactly as it had been since the 12th of August, 1940. That is the third layer of the answer, and it is the strangest one. What kept firing at that coast after the German front collapsed was a machine still carrying out an order from a war that had already been decided, pointed the wrong way, shooting at a target it could never take, killing an old woman in a shelter, while the men who were actually beating Germany walked up the hill behind it. And there was only one way to make it stop. Not from Dover, not from the air. Somebody had to stand on it. Lindemann was finished. Dover was safe from that battery for the first time in 4 years. But out on Cape Gris Nez, 3 more batteries were untouched, and they had not fired their last rounds yet. And in Calais itself, behind the flooded ground and the old bastions, Lieutenant Colonel Ludwig Schroeder was working out a proposition, one that would cost Canadian lives for a reason that had nothing whatsoever to do with winning the war. Between the ridge and the town of Calais, there was a belt of ground the Germans had spent 4 years preparing and then, at the last minute, flooded. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles hit the strong point at Vieux-Coquelle on the main road and ran into what the record calls a bitter, close-quarter fight. Bomb-proof concrete shelters that had to be emptied one by one. Then the village of Coquelle itself, house to house. The Regina Rifles fought forward on the open slope with the tanks of the 1st Hussars. The 1st Canadian Scottish came up through minefields on the coastal road, feeling for Fort La Pin. On the 27th, the Canadians pulled their own forward troops backwards off the ground they had just bought, so that Bomber Command could come in again. 342 Lancasters, 1,700 tons. and then went back up the same slope a second time. That was the day the Canadian Scottish took Fort Lapin, with tanks, with crocodiles burning the embrasures, behind smoke. And that night, D Company and 2 extra platoons of that battalion crossed a stretch of water south of a position called Bastion 11 and got themselves onto the far side. They stayed there for 48 hours, no reinforcement, no resupply. 2 days, cut off, on the wrong bank in a fortified town, living on what they had carried in their pouches, while a mile away the war they belonged to went on without them. At Fort Nieuwlay, the Winnipegs used flame. The battalion's own account of what followed is almost embarrassed by how well it worked. After warming the enemy up a little, the white flag was seen hoisted, and hundreds of Germans poured out through the open doors. Hundreds. Out of one fort. Through the doors they opened themselves. By the 28th of September, Ludwig Schroeder's position was, in the plain language of the reports, desperate. Morale had gone. Men were deserting. A Canadian civil affairs officer picked up word that the commandant was about ready to consider surrendering, and the Canadians sent a message across proposing a meeting. 10 in the morning, the 29th, at a place called Le Pont Sans-Pareil, north of Ardres. Orders went out to the Canadian battalions. No further firing except on an active enemy. Schroeder did not come. He sent representatives instead, and what they brought to the table tells you what the last week of this fortress was really about. First, they proposed that Calais be declared an open city, that the Germans simply stop being attacked. Major General Dan Spry refused. It was a delaying tactic, and everyone in the room knew it. Then they asked for 48 hours to evacuate the civilian population. Spry gave them 24, until noon on the 30th. 20,000 French civilians walked out of Calais under that truce, east along the roads, into the hands of Canadian civil affairs staff, who fed them and found them somewhere to sleep. Colonel Stacy's later judgment was that watching those people leave completed the demoralization of the garrison. And at a further conference, Colonel J.J. Hurley, the senior civil affairs officer of 2nd Canadian Corps, actually sat down with Schroeder himself. Hurley came away with an impression that he wrote down, and I want to read it to you as close to his words as I can, because in 6 weeks of this campaign, nothing else says so much in one sentence. The Germans, he judged, would surrender after a sufficient show of resistance had been made to make their surrender appear an honorable one. A sufficient show of resistance. Stop and take that apart, because it is the 4th layer of our answer, and it is the one that is genuinely hard to sit with. The port was already destroyed by German engineers before the battle. The front was 300 miles away and going the wrong way for Berlin. The garrison was old men, sick men, sailors, and anti-aircraft gunners, and its own commander called it rubbish. Nobody in that town believed they were holding anything. Nobody expected relief. There was no relief within 500 miles. What was still being defended in the last days of Calais was an appearance, a quantity of resistance sufficient to make the surrender look right on paper in Berlin. And resistance is not an abstraction. Resistance means shells, and shells land on somebody. Canadian riflemen went across flooded ground and into concrete shelters, and Canadian families got telegrams so that a fortress commandant's file would read correctly. That is what was still firing at Canadians in the last week of September 1944. Not an army, not a strategy, a formality, being satisfied at somebody else's expense. At noon on the 30th, the truce ran out. Within an hour, the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa were sending situation reports back that read like a man watching a dam go. Enemy pouring out. Asked what was happening, the answer that went over the radio was, "Don't know, but they are sure coming out." The Canadian Scottish went into Bastion 11 and the citadel behind the crocodiles and found, in the official phrase, very little active resistance. The garrison simply waited to be taken prisoner. At 7 that evening, Schroeder surrendered to Lieutenant Colonel P.C. Klen of the Camerons. There was no ceremonial hall available, so they used a desk in a French farmhouse, and the Canadians staged it as impressively as they could manage, because the man across the desk needed it to look like something. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the 1st of October, all resistance in Calais had ended. Around 7,500 prisoners. Canadian casualties for the whole operation, under 300. The harbour, of course, was wrecked. Calais would not open until November, and then only for troops and a train ferry. But the truce meeting at Le Pont-Saint-Péray began at 10 o'clock on the 29th of September, and by then, 10 miles down the coast, the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade had already been fighting for 3.5 hours. September 29th, 1944. 35 minutes past 6 in the morning, on the open ground behind Cape Gris Nez. The artillery opens. 10 minutes later, at 6:45, the infantry and the armour of the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade start moving toward the last of it. 4 batteries sat on that headland, and this is what the Canadians were walking at. Battery Todt at Herringzels, 4 15-inch guns. Grosse Kurfürst at Floringzell, 4 11-inch guns in revolving turrets. Battery Gris Nez, right out on the western tip, 3 of 6.7 inches. A 4th at Visson had already been overrun days earlier. The 2 big ones threw shells more than 25 miles, and, this matters, Grosse Kurfürst and Gris Nez could turn and fire inland, meaning at the Canadians. The crews were not army. They were the 242nd Naval Coastal Artillery Battalion, sailors, working guns of naval caliber, on a cliff in France, 4 years after the invasion of England had been quietly filed away. Around them the Germans had laid mines, electrified fencing, anti-tank ditches, machine gun posts, and field pieces sighted to cover the approaches. Bomber command had already been over twice. 532 aircraft on the 26th, 302 more on the 28th, putting 855 tons onto that headland alone. And there was one more piece of fire support, and it is the piece I have been waiting the whole story to tell you about. Brigadier Todd's fire plan for Cape Gris Nez included guns that were not in France. Across the channel, on the cliffs of Kent, the British had 2 14-inch guns, salvaged off a battleship and named, by their crews, Winnie and Pooh, and 2 15-inch guns at Wanstone. For 4 years, those weapons had dueled with the German batteries across 21 miles of water, and for 4 years, neither side had been able to finish it. On the 29th of September, with a spotter aircraft circling overhead to correct them, the British guns at Dover fired across the channel to cover Canadian infantry walking up to the German guns. They hit the Floringzella position and damaged it, and the Canadian gunners' relief at that is recorded, because the men going in had expected that battery to hurt them badly. Think about what that is. The oldest artillery duel of the Second World War, 4 years of shells across that water in both directions, and it ends with one side reaching over and holding the other side down, so that infantry from a country 3,000 miles away can climb up and switch it off by hand. They went in behind a creeping barrage. The Highland Light Infantry of Canada had Grosse Kurfürst and Gris Nez. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders had Todt. The armor struggled immediately, not because of the enemy, but because of the bomb craters. Flails beat lanes through the mines. AVREs drove up and dropped fascines into the anti-tank ditches so the tanks could cross. On the northern flank, there was almost no fight at all. The Highland Light Infantry War Diary describes it with something close to bewilderment. The barrage crept ahead of the troops and was very effective in keeping the enemy's heads down, and as soon as our troops got into the enemy positions, the white flags started popping up. By 10:30 in the morning, all 4 guns of Grosse Kurfürst were in Canadian hands. Battery Gris Nez went in the afternoon. Down at Todt it was harder, and it produced the sharpest tactical lesson of the campaign. The North Novas got to the battery before the crews understood an attack was coming. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel D.F. Forbes, had personally gone forward and looked the place over first, and the story that went round that battalion afterward was that he had walked up and knocked on the steel door of a casemate. Nobody has ever proved that one. The men believed it, which tells you what they thought of him. Then an AVRE was brought up to number 3 gun and began firing petards into the casemate. those 40-pound charges at almost point-blank range. Against the walls, the report says, they had little real effect, but they went through the window slits. That is the whole answer to the Atlantic Wall in one line. 4 years of concrete, 17 million cubic meters of it, and it was beaten by a short mortar, putting charges through the openings the gunners needed in order to see. While the petards went in through the slits, Canadian infantry threw grenades into the open front of the casemate. The battery was taken by mid-morning. The Canadians went on and captured the German headquarters at Cran-aux-Oeufs, and now the moment this whole story has been walking toward. Among the guns the Highland Light Infantry overran, one crew kept working after Canadian soldiers had physically climbed onto their gun. The record is precise about it. The last to fire, with Canadian infantry actually standing on the revolving turret, fired one shell wildly out to sea, another in the direction of Dover, and one more inland, before the sappers could put it out of action. 3 rounds, one at the sea, one at England, one at the ground the Canadians were standing on. That is your answer in a single image, not fanaticism, a mechanism still executing, with the men who had already beaten it standing on top of it. The cost of taking those batteries, the batteries that had shelled England for 4 years and 1 month, was 42 Canadian casualties, 8 of them killed. About 1,600 Germans went into the cages. 8 men. That is what the last day of it cost. That night, for the first time since August 1940, Dover was safe. The Highland Light Infantry War Diary put it better than any historian has. Now the people of Dover can relax, knowing that the cross-channel guns are silenced. General Spry had the flag taken down from Battery Tote and sent across the water as a gift to the mayor of Dover. Except that General Crerar's list had 4 ports on it, and one of them nobody ever attacked. Dunkirk was the one they left alone. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division closed up to it in the middle of September 1944 and found roughly 12,000 Germans inside, under a naval officer, Vice Admiral Friedrich Fliesius, sitting behind flooded fields and 4 years of concrete. The probing attacks went in. They did not go well. And then somebody made the decision that this whole campaign had been teaching them to make. Don't. Montgomery's attention had turned to Antwerp, the port that could actually change the war, the one whose approaches the 1st Canadian Army would spend the next 2 months clearing at a cost that dwarfs everything in this story. So Dunkirk was masked instead of stormed. A ring was drawn around it and troops were left to hold that ring, and the Canadians went east to the Scheldt. Look at what that decision was made of, because it is not caution. It is arithmetic paid for in men. Boulogne, 634 Canadian casualties, for a harbor German engineers had already destroyed 4 days before the assault began, which could not take a ship until the 12th of October. Calais, under 300 casualties, for a harbor that did not open until November, and then only for troops. Cape Gris Nez was worth it. That one ended the shelling of England. Dunkirk was worth nothing to anybody. So nobody paid for it. Fliesius was left in his fortress to be exactly what he already was, a garrison guarding a wrecked harbor that no one wanted in a war that had gone past him. He kept firing anyway, for 7.5 more months, through the Battle of the Scheldt, through the failure at Arnhem, through the Ardennes and the Rhine crossings, and the collapse of the German armies in the east and the west, through the fall of Berlin. And in the last days, the Reich did something for Dunkirk that it could no longer do for its own capital. On the 28th of April and the 2nd of May, 1945, the German Navy sent Seehunds, 2-man midget submarines, across to resupply the garrison. On those runs, the crews took the torpedoes off the outside of the hull and hung food containers there instead. Sit with that image for a moment. Berlin is finished. The state is hours from dissolving, and 2 men are lying in a steel tube the size of a car, crossing the channel underwater, carrying groceries to a fortress that is protecting nothing at all, because an order issued on the 4th of September 1944 said the port was to be held to the last man, and nobody ever canceled it. Fliesius surrendered Dunkirk on the 9th of May 1945, to Brigadier General Alois Lischka of the Czechoslovak Armored Brigade that had taken over the ring. The 8th of May was the day the German surrender took effect, which means the thing that had been firing at this coast outlived the country that told it to fire. By 1 day. Now go back to where we started. A chalk ridge east of Boulogne, the 17th of September, a Canadian section commander pulling himself up over the side of a turretless tank, while 792 bombers turned for home, believing, reasonably, that nothing on that hill could still be alive. He was wrong, and now you know why. It was never about who was in the concrete. The garrisons were old men and sick men and sailors. Their own commanders called them rubbish and low category, and not especially high. It was never about a port, because the ports were destroyed by German engineers before the first Canadian shell landed. And by the end, at Calais, it was not even about holding anything. It was about producing a sufficient show of resistance to make a surrender look honorable on paper. Here is what kept firing at Canadians after every other German front collapsed. Not an army, and not a belief. A machine built on the assumption that the war would come to it once and never move again. When the war moved, the machine could not, and so it went on doing the only thing it had ever been designed to do at whatever was in front of it, at ships, at England, at an old woman 38 feet underground in a shelter in Dover, at Canadian infantry on a hillside, long after there was anything left to win. It could not be reasoned with, and it could not be reached from 20 miles away by any weapon either side possessed. It stopped when men walked up to it and stood on it. Ferdinand Heim went to prison camps in Britain and was sent home to Germany in 1948. Patience Ransley, 63 years old, remains the last civilian killed by the cross-channel guns. And the flag that came down off Battery Tote on the 29th of September went across the water to the mayor of Dover from a Canadian general who understood exactly what the people of that town had just stopped hearing. 42 casualties on the headland, 8 men dead. 4 years and 1 month of shelling ended in a morning by a brigade of Canadians nobody in Dover ever met. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. It's a corner of the war that doesn't get told often, and you gave it your time. If you think what the Canadians did on this coast deserves to be remembered, a like genuinely helps it find more people. And if you'd like to hear more, we're here every week. And if your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Second World War, I'd be honored to hear about him in the comments.